Hello, and welcome to this episode of the Alien Familiar RPG Podcast. I am Clayton.
I'm Jordan.
And before we get started, you can find show notes and more at alienfamiliar.com. You can email us at alienfamiliarmedia@gmail.com. We are on Facebook at facebook.com/alienfamiliar. And if you would like to help us out with hosting costs and every other cost that is associated with this show, you can do so at patreon.com/alienfamiliarmedia. Today, we are going to be talking about session prep for dungeon masters or game masters. Particularly, what Jordan and I do in order to prepare for our games, what we've done in the past to prep for games, if we've changed how we prep at all, which we've both been gaming for a number of years now, and I'm sure that things have changed and evolved as new resources become available, and just our ability to be more comfortable with game mastering has evolved and grown.
How did you start when you first started throwing together D&D games and stuff?
My first game that I ever ran, I prepped probably, we played for about 6 hours, and I prepped probably close to 40 hours between setting up each individual area and room that the player characters might possibly go to, completely statting out NPCs, completely statting out each enemy.
Did you have an inventory of what was in the rooms and stuff?
Absolutely. Well, I didn't really have a frame of reference. I just had a module that I had that was an introductory module. So I was basing it on that, and I was like, okay, in order to run this this adventure that's probably going to last 4 or 5 sessions, I need to have a 30-page book.
So you weren't doing that when running the module. You were using whatever the module content was then. But if you were creating something completely fresh, then you would try to basically write an entire module for your adventure.
The first time I ran something that wasn't the module, it was that much prep.
Wow. I had a little bit of a different start. The first game I ran was Middle-earth role-playing way the fuck back when. And I did have some modules for that, but I don't think I ever ran any of the modules directly. I would just go through them for some ideas and just start dumping stuff into Microsoft Word. Most of my time was spent on hex map or grid maps. So I did do a ton of that stuff because that was fun. But as far as statting out every single dude or any of that, I was just cobbling together whatever the hell was already available. I don't know that I made a single unique character, new character, when I was running that stuff. But I did a shitload of work on system things, like making new spells and blah, blah, blah. But that was reusable stuff throughout multiple adventures. You're talking about stuff that's one shot.
I was planning on running a 5 or 6 session thing, and I was writing a module, attempting to professionally write a module.
Did you have any notion in your head of reusability at that point?
Not really.
Yeah.
I didn't. Whenever I first started gaming, I didn't have nobody in our group who had ever played D&D before. So we were going at it completely fresh. The only thing we had for reference was what was in the books and what was in that one module.
I think the first time that I got way into that level that you're talking about was when I was running Star Wars the first time, and I had the entire ship down to individual systems, every square meter of the ship plotted out, all the stuff that's in each thing, and then anytime they would go to a planet, have a ridiculous amount of detail of what's going on in that planet. I'd take stuff from Wikipedia or whatever if it was an existing planet, but I had plenty of new planets too. And that's when I got heavy into building NPCs and whatever, but I still have a lot of that stuff in binders, and I reused a lot of those NPCs. I think when I realized that I loved running Star Wars, and then I would run multiple campaigns of it is when it started occurring to me like, holy shit, I can go back and reuse these same things, give it a different name, whatever. So there was this book that came out with the Star Wars D20 Revised that was sort of a DM guide, but mostly just a toolkit for scene building stuff in Star Wars. And it had, generic cantina layout and a bunch of stuff that's going to be in there. A ton of random NPCs and like weird rules for like, how many hit points do blast doors have, or, stuff like that, like traps and like just all the stuff laying around in the world. And it was, probably a 250 page book or something. D20 Modern had something like that too. And as soon as I started finding books like that, it clicked with me like, wait a second, I don't have to make every fucking thing from scratch. Like,
yeah,
they're not going to remember that they've been in this cantina before. I'll just drop this cantina in. Did you ever get into reusable stuff like that, like published resources?
It was a little while before I started doing that. It wasn't until I read the advice on thirdedition.org that a website that no longer exists, that I figured out or learned, hey, I can just reskin.
Mm-hmm.
And that things like you were talking about, like the stats for all of these, all of the minutia in the world are probably either already been worked out by somebody else or can just be this blanket thing that doesn't have to be completely statted out.
Mm-hmm. I think that assembling that toolkit, whatever the contents of it you want to be, putting that together is sort of like it's not session 0, it's like session -1 for the DM alone.
Mm-hmm.
That you think about what you want your campaign or your adventure to be, and then you just go mad grabbing resources. Doesn't have to be books from the same system. I use books from different systems all the time for different shit when I'm putting stuff together, depending on what I'm running. Grabbing your image resources off of, Google image search or whatever. I've got, I don't know how many images in a folder on my hard drive that's just for role-playing stuff, split up into, genres. It's like, man, I need a dragon. Here's 70 dragons that I've saved over the years,
Yep.
Like whatever. You got the same kind of thing?
I have the exact same thing.
But doing that stuff saves you so much time. If you've got a set of random tables, like, my God, that is the bread and butter of Apocalyptia, is random tables, because nobody has time to sit around and list every damn thing. Like, look around this room. How big would the list be if you had every fucking thing in this place itemized?
Uh-huh.
And this is not a terribly cluttered room, and pick any room you go to is going to be like that. Yeah, get some sweet random tables, get some generic stuff, generic maps, some generic NPCs. At that point, you got 80% of the work done.
Yeah, I don't know how big my map folder is at this point. It was, before I joined the RPG Maps Reddit,
mm-hmm.
it was huge before then, and it has only grown exponentially since then.
Yeah. I don't understand. I mean, I guess it's, teach their own. I don't understand unless you've got a real specific use case, using something like one of these fantasy map editors to like make your entire thing in detail. I get it, I guess, if you're making a whole new world and you want your continent laid out or whatever. But as far as like cities or castles, shit like that, like there's a million of them.
Somebody has already made it.
Mm-hmm.
Anything you can conceive of, somebody has already made a fantasy or a role-playing game map for it.
Yeah.
I challenge anyone to prove me wrong.
I mean, if that's just your thing, if you just want to sit around and make a world in extreme detail, knock yourself out. But if you're just wanting to run a game that people are going to enjoy, you really have to think about what the payoff is. And player enjoyment versus each hour that you're spending on it.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know how many times I've either over-prepared or played in a game that was over-prepared, and it's pretty obvious when people are really disappointed that they just chose not to go in that room that you spent 3 hours laying shit out in, you know, or even following entire adventure lines that you got laid out in elaborate detail. Like, you have to keep that modular approach in mind when you're designing this stuff. And it's fine to like, oh, well, I had this laid out behind door A, but they went to door B, so goddamn if it didn't just hop behind the scenes and now they're in door A, actually. They'll never know the difference.
Yeah. I found that the more work you put into actually putting something onto paper, the more likely that stuff you've put onto paper isn't going to end up coming up in the game. So I probably do 95% of my prep is mental, and only 5 or less is actually putting shit down on paper or in a document.
Yeah. My note taking largely consists of like pregame note stuff is an outline of things that have already been established that I don't want to contradict. Yeah. And everything else is just kind of possibilities, you know?
Yeah, most of my my writing down prep for the next session is happening during the previous session while I'm jotting down notes on what you all are saying. Or you say something and it's a damn good idea and I know I want to use it, so I jot it down so that what's going to happen next time.
Yeah, mine the shit out of your players' brains because they're going to think of more shit than you are. Guaranteed. I think that there's also, we kind of hinted at it a little bit with the, door A, door B thing, but I think there's also a tendency for the amount of prep that you do to influence the way that you run the game. And if you show up with this huge stack of notes and you want all of this shit to go just so, you're going to be presenting, whether you do it consciously or unconsciously, a very linear on-rails kind of story to people because you're invested in all that content. And there's no, you haven't left a lot of wiggle room in there if you're married to your story like that. And if you show up with very little, you've given the players a palette on which to just go nuts. Maybe you can roll with that, maybe you can't. But I think some kind of balance in there of, having a deep pouch of stuff to pull from and drop wherever they might go gives them liberty and also gives you payoff for the time that you've spent filling up that pouch.
Yeah. A book that came out several years ago that I use is called Never Unprepared, The Complete Game Master's Guide to Session Prep. And one of the things they say in there is that when you're designing your adventure, you should be preparing to improv.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. How do you do that with things like we've been talking a lot about like populating the world with like objects and people or whatever, but when it's a role-playing scenario, when it's a conversational thing with an NPC, how do you roll with that? Do you do much prep when you're like, here's a scene I want to have with, person X saying whatever to the group? Or
the majority of my prep for my sessions happens in my car going to and from work because I got a 25-minute drive. And I will play through my mind potential scenarios of like what the player characters might ask that person. And I'm getting down how that person will respond. I'm not only figuring out what they're going to be saying, I'm also figuring out how they're going to be saying it. I'm practicing their voice. I'm practicing their cadence, their diction. So that whenever it does come to that and they start asking all of the questions that are not on my paper, I have a pretty good idea of who that character is so I can just roll with it.
Yeah.
I have written down a few points that this is the information that they have. And whether the players ask the questions that reveal that information or not, doesn't really matter because I can just give that information to the next NPC. And the conversation that they're having with this one person that I planned just seems like it flows a lot better. I know what they're going to be I know who they are, so I know what they're going to be saying if I get tripped up.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like over my years of practice at doing that, I have gotten much, much better at holding a conversation as a different person than I have as holding a conversation as myself.
You look back over your character notes. That's hilarious.
And I'm not entirely joking, because when I do a job interview,
mm-hmm.
I'm not going in as me. I'm going in as the me that has that job.
Yeah, I get that. The professional Clayton.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think we all do that to a large extent, various parts of our lives. When I've got a bunch of NPCs, like, for one thing, I tend to have a minimal amount of NPCs in a game. It's probably my own role-playing experience that I came up with a lot of DMs that would like to have a bunch of their own NPCs tagging along, and a lot of times I remember NPC stuff overshadowing PC stuff, and I think
mm-hmm.
that's kind of a cardinal sin.
Yeah.
So when I'm putting stuff together, I tend to have NPCs that are around if the players want to go to them. If an NPC shows up to actively engage in the group, then that's definitely a story hook.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't typically try to have, sidekicks hanging out or, whoever that's just along for the ride. I don't like playing in games where the DM also wanted to play in his own game, so he's got his player character there, That's disastrous, I think, most of the time.
Well, the game master has no control over who the players like, which NPCs the players are going to like.
Mm-hmm.
And the NPCs that the players like are going to be the ones that come back into the story. And if you put all this prep into a particular character, it's guaranteed that they're not going to love that character.
Mm-hmm.
They're going to love the character you just made up 5 seconds before they started talking to him.
Yeah. Another useful thing to have in the bag is a random name generator.
Absolutely.
Holy shit. Nothing's worse than...
If you can't...
What's your name?
And if you can't have a random name generator, have just a list of names in front of you.
Absolutely. God, there are a few things more fourth wall breaking than being in a conversation with an NPC and their name comes up and they got nothing.
And there's nothing that tells the players, oh, this guy doesn't matter.
Yeah.
Like the game master doesn't know their name.
Yep. This guy didn't exist 5 minutes ago.
Yep.
This is no one. When you're thinking about like the storyline, like the story arc of a given session or a campaign, both I guess are interesting. Are you thinking about like, story structure practices for a session? Are you thinking about like rising action and climax and blah 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 and like trying to pace out a session or a campaign like that? Or do you just kind of let it roll as it comes?
Depends. If it's a one-shot, yes. If it's a campaign, I don't do that for each session. I try to have something like that. I try to follow the Joseph Campbell's Hero with 1,000 Faces. I kind of try to follow that format for a campaign as a whole, but for an individual session, God, no, I have no control over what the player characters are going to do any given night. So,
right.
It's to try to enforce some sort of structure onto that is impossible.
Mm-hmm.
And even in a campaign, I'm going to put I'm going to have like a few plot points of what's going to be happening. And usually those plot points are assuming the player characters do nothing.
Yeah.
And that way, when the player characters do the unforeseen thing that totally goes around the problem that I presented to them, I can roll with it.
Do you ever have like a logic tree or anything, like a decision tree in mind? Like if you give them a binary choice or something, do you have those contingencies already kind of worked out, or?
I used to, but I have... If you give the player characters a binary choice, they will lock themselves down until they come up with a third option.
Mm-hmm.
They will not advance until a third option is discovered.
Yeah, that's probably right. Unless there is an obvious, like, best choice for them between the two. Yeah, you're right.
Yeah, anytime that any moral dilemma where it's not clear which side is right, well, that almost never happens because there's always going to be at least one player in the group who for themselves have an idea in their mind of what is right, and they're always going to go to that. So that's when you can manipulate the situation in order to play to that, in order to make a certain result happen.
Mm-hmm.
But instead of trying to do simple binary choices, I try to present choices that I know the player characters are going to try to come up with some sort of... Player characters, by definition, are going to always want to try to come out with the best possible outcome. And so I don't put as much prep into crafting how to make sure that that all sides are perfectly balanced.
Mm-hmm.
I think about the motivations of each side that they've got to choose between, and I really want to be able to be in the moment and understand where the problems in the player character's logic are going to be, because I know the situation well enough that whenever they're discussing the potential resolutions, I can present with them logically why something will work, mm-hmm. or why something won't work.
Mm-hmm.
So that's where most of my mental energy goes into creating dilemmas.
When you're thinking about stuff going on in a session, do you think about individual player characters and what, like how they might respond or interpret things or whatever? Do you put content in specifically for individuals?
I try to, but I don't put something in huge, mm-hmm. because inevitably that person will not be there. Mm. I try to make it so that anybody could come across, like anyone would be able to learn a particular thing, a particular piece of information. But for instance, the rogue might have an easier time at learning some deep dark secret because of their connections with the Thieves Guild. I have a path of least resistance way of getting to a solution, but I try to make sure that if that one particular player isn't there, the remaining players in the group will be able to come up with the information somehow.
I think it's worth considering when you're laying out a session, maybe not putting in content specifically for one player character. I mean, you definitely can, but at the very least, just kind of run through the list of who your likely player characters are going to be, and think about, do they have something to engage in that session? Because it's really, really boring to show up with whatever character and there just be nothing to plug into in the scenario that the DM's laid out for you. You're just watching other people do things more effectively than you could. You know what I'm saying? Like, if you got some, highly magical thing where only the casters are going to be doing cool stuff, your fighter is going to be bummed for the whole session. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I think it's really easy to have a cool idea, but not actually consider in practice what it's going to look like from each of the player characters' perspectives. Mm-hmm. That's all I mean to say with that.
In particular, whenever I try to create content for a particular player and their character, I'm generally trying to do it for the player or the character who seems, maybe they're the quiet person at the group, or they're the person who hasn't had much time in the spotlight lately. Mm-hmm. I try to focus on those characters whenever I do present stuff that their character is the one who is going to be able to do it the easiest.
When you're thinking about the player characters within your story and the individual player character's personal engagement with your story, do you think it's more the DM's job to try to engage the player character into that story, or do you think it's more on the PC to get in there and like hook themselves into what's going on somehow?
I feel like the game master needs to be able to put some things in there that they know should that with what they know of the player and the character should pique their interest.
Mm-hmm.
But the game master does not have the obligation of making a player at the table interested in the things that they are saying.
Yeah, you couldn't force it. That's impossible. But you do think that there is an obligation on the DM to have a slot somewhere that player character fits into.
If it's a player who isn't as engaged as the other players of the group, maybe they're the quiet one, the shy one. I do try to give them something specifically so that they can have their spotlight time.
Oh, you're talking about that as like an equalizing function.
That's how I try to do it. That's why I put that content in there.
Okay, so if somebody's already engaged, you're not going to like...
I'm probably not going to give
engaged.
them... Yeah, I'm probably not going to give them a particular thing that only their character can go a certain path.
Mm-hmm. I guess there's two different things inside there. There's the one part that's like the character's capabilities. That, obviously the rogue is the one you want to do the heist or whatever. But then there's, separate from the class or whatever their skill set is, there's the character itself and that character's personal motivations.
So as a game master, I try to present things that I think that the player would be interested in.
Mm-hmm.
But when it comes to the session, I want the players to be the ones to engage in what's going on. I will present the information, but I'm not going to sit there and say, hey, this guy keeps coming up to you and like talking about this cave out in the middle of nowhere
mm-hmm.
that supposedly has all these riches in it. If I put it out there, it's up to the player characters then themselves to motivate themselves if they're going to go out there, or if they're not, then, well, hopefully I'll have something else that they can engage with
mm-hmm.
as the plot for the session. I
don't know how many times I've been in a campaign or been running one and made this mistake where if I'm a player, I've been doing it long enough that I can see where the adventure hook is when it's presented, but if it's some obtuse thing that, especially if it's like a high risk thing and it's not evident as to why
mm-hmm.
I should care, or even worse, if it's like something that would force that character to do something that they absolutely wouldn't just for the sake of doing the thing the DM came up with, I think that's bad adventure design.
Yeah.
You've got to consider the characters that your players have made, because they're the action of the story. They are the agents in this thing. And mm-hmm. if you failed to give a plausible motivation for them to do something, like, you can't expect them to just go along with it because that's what you wrote for that week, right?
Mm-hmm. Right. And that's actually a big flaw that I have. I've been working on it a long time, of making sure that my adventure hooks aren't too obtuse, or mm-hmm. that they're too just not interesting.
Right.
I struggle with it, and each time it happens, I'm like, God damn it, Clayton, you've been doing this for 20 years now. Haven't you fucking learned how to make things sound interesting?
Right. I mean, there's also responsibility on the player side too, of course.
Yeah.
You can't make a character that's, some grumpy edgelord who's just, too cool for everything.
Yeah.
That person's unmotivatable. But yeah, you shouldn't expect someone to go completely counter to character just to go check out your cool bad guy or something. That's a tough thing to pull off. I mean, you're talking about a lot of different characters with different motivations, And I think it's perfectly fine to present something where if you've got a 6-person group and you can motivate 4 of them, and then you've got some cool party conflict that's, 4 people arguing with the other 2 about why they have to do that, that's legit. But if you drop an adventure hook and everybody's just sitting there looking at you like, what? Why? Like, nah, do it over.
What kills me is whenever I put a plot hook out and then the player characters are discussing why they're not going to be able to handle it. Like, oh, this sounds too dangerous. We're too low level. We need to get all these other things in line before we would be able to tackle something as dire as that. Or that's a problem for the really big heroes. We're just these scrubs down in bumfuck boondocks, and we can't handle anything like that.
There's an interesting question. If, let's say you are on session, 1, 2, or 3 or something, and you're kind of juggling in a campaign the overarching story, and let's say you're teasing, big bad in the castle at the end or whatever. Mm-hmm. Meanwhile, you're also trying to get them interested in the low-level dungeon to get them prepped for that thing. If they decide, hell with it, let's bum rush the gates, is it just time for a TPK or what?
Usually I don't have the big bad of the campaign revealed until maybe the midpoint of the campaign, whenever that is. But if the player characters suddenly decide that they're going to go and they've heard a rumor that there's a dragon nearby, and they're determined that they're going to go find out where its lair is so that they can kill it, and they're only first level, well, then I start laying it on thick of like the stories about what they've heard of what this danger actually is. Give them skill checks to know, you're wanting to fight this dragon? Well, with all the information that you've learned so far, this is an ancient red dragon, and it's although this is something that your characters wouldn't particularly directly translate in, but out of character, you know that this is a level 15 encounter, and your guys are only level 3.
Mm-hmm. But in A New Hope, we'll give Luke 3, 4 levels, pushing it by the end of episode 4. Motherfucker goes from 0-level peasant hanging out on the farm to blowing up the Death Star in a pretty short span of time there, like in world time. Yeah. Right? He did not have a huge, training montage that you could dump a bunch of levels into, really. I don't know. I wonder, I guess it's a question of how you want your game to be. Do you want it to be, how closely you want it to be tied to the mechanics of the difficulty in things, that's built into the game system. Like, you could have a D&D game or whatever that's very much like an MMO where there's these high-level zones where you're just going to get fucked if you go in there at first level or something. Or if you're really just using that stuff as, a convenient way of dealing with challenges or whatever, the game mechanics, and you don't really care about scaling. I don't know, maybe they can pull it off earlier than you expected.
It also depends on the game system.
Mm-hmm.
Like a game system in which there isn't a huge disparity between characters who are freshly made and characters who have played for 30 sessions.
Mm-hmm.
And the player characters decide, you know what, we're going to go try to fuck up that big bad. If it's a game system that, like Savage Worlds, where things are, or Apocalyptia, where things are pretty well balanced so that the things that are a threat now are always going to be a threat. There's not going to be anything that you encounter that is just going to be a situation where you can just walk through it.
Mm-hmm.
If everything that is deadly now is going to be deadly in 30 levels or in 30 sessions, I might let them go and try to siege the big bad's castle.
Yeah. I think I kind of prefer games like that because that puts the skill of it in the planning more than just, the brute force of your stats. that you could have a real dumb plan and still succeed if you're a high level character in D&D. Yeah, there's something really appealing to me about a low level character that just figured out where the fucking porthole is on the Death Star. And fuck you, pal. That's awesome.
Something I will tell you that I would do in that situation of the player character suddenly decide they're going to do that. Getting there is going to take more than one session. Mm-hmm. So that I can plan what the fuck is going to happen when they get there.
How do you feel about TPKs, the total party kill? Are you averse to allowing it to happen, or if you've got a group that just puts themselves in that situation, do you just kind of let the damage roll as it will?
Depends on the system, and it depends on how they got into that situation. If it is a very lethal game, yeah, I explained that combat sucks and that anyone can get shot in the head and go down when in one hit. If it's a game system where the player characters are sitting on top of a big stack of hit points, and it's just due to poor planning where they get into a fight and things are going bad because they didn't know what they were going to face, I'll let them die. Mm-hmm. If it's a situation where they plan it out well, but the bad guy, I suddenly roll 4 crits in a row, I'll drop a couple characters, and the rest of them can decide if discretion is the better part of valor. Mm-hmm. And if they don't think it is, then, well, the dice are going to continue to roll as they roll.
So you'll take that Sun Tzu approach of always giving them a route of retreat.
If they've done a bad plan and they are committed to that bad plan, then I will always give them an out. If they realize 3 rounds into combat that, oh shit, this plan fucking sucks because we thought that this thing was vulnerable to fire, but it's invulnerable to fire, I will allow them a tactical retreat. But I've also seen groups where we thought he was vulnerable to fire, turns out he's invulnerable to fire. You know what? We're here. We're gonna stick it out. Yeah, those characters are dead. So I want to kind of go back to like what you do before the session even starts. Mm-hmm. What do you do as far as research for the session? Do you do anything to? Do you do any research? Because I do a lot of research. Mm-hmm. I look up the rules that if there's any fringe case rules that I think are going to happen, I look those up. About every 2 months during the course of a campaign, I will try to reread the combat section of the rules just to make sure that because that's the way that house rules end up coming into games. I've noticed is you don't exactly remember a rule, and so you make a call on the fly, and then you forget what the real rule was. Mm-hmm. I also spend a lot of time reading up on setting lore. Mm-hmm. Whether that is a fantasy setting, what's a sci-fi setting, or something in the real world. Right now I'm running a zombie apocalypse game, and I'm reading a lot about just what stores are in the area because it's based on a real location. I'm looking up maps of topographical maps, using Google Maps to see, okay, where are the shopping centers? Where are where's the power plant? Where are all the gas stations? Mm-hmm. Where are the convenience stores? Where's the groceries? Where are the grocers? So that I can have an idea in my head when it comes up, the player characters suddenly say, okay, we need X. I can know where that is. Mm-hmm. Do you
Yeah, I do a lot of that same stuff. If it's a published setting, if it's an existing game setting, let's say I'm running Star Wars, then yeah, if I know that I'm sending them to, some random planet, I'll go and read up on all the lore, because they're going to be possibly expecting certain things to be there that I might not know about, because they've got access to that setting independent of what I'm presenting. So I think that's cool. You can definitely hook people in by, dropping things that, they like from that setting. If it's something that I'm creating, then I'm always going to be reviewing whatever I've already established when I go to start adding to it, because I don't want to, contradict myself. The DM is the ultimate source of truth for the setting, if it's going to have any coherency at all. If I make a ruling on something, like a house rule, mid-session, I will note that down every time. And if it's, after, I'll go back and look at what the actual rule is, if there is one. If I like it, then, I might do that. If I like the house rule better, I might just establish it as a house rule. I think that's okay. I mean, yeah, you got to be like totally familiar with the mechanics, like the fundamental mechanics of the system. But you're right. If there's something that's coming up, if you've got a whole session that's built around, a couple of spells, for instance, happening, you want to know every goddamn thing that can go on with those spells. Don't just throw a wish in there without reading the wish description. Yeah, it's mostly review of what's already come before, so that I know where my avenues are to build on that. And also, the last, let's say 30 minutes of a game session, after things have already wrapped up and you're kind of in that, sort of upkeep phase of whatever is going on, listening to what the players want to do next time, or what their theories are, or, whatever. That's stuff that's well worth jotting down while they think that you're packing your shit away. Because that's going to be, for one thing, it'll prepare you on what their trajectory is going to likely be next time. And you're probably going to get better ideas than you might have come up with on your own. But going back to the post-apocalyptic zombie stuff, when I was designing Apocalyptia, I did a shitload of research on all that exact kind of shit that you're talking about, so as to fill that toolbox with all of these random things that you would need. So yeah, I've run a couple games doing that exact thing with with Google Maps, and having, the little icons for gas stations or whatever. I don't think that I would run a game without a laptop on hand now. So most of my prep stuff is in digital form, and is going to consist, the materials are going to consist of that sort of thing. And so much of what I rely on to have things prepared is spontaneous generation of content, which is much easier to do, if you've just got the laptop open. But yeah, it depends on what I'm running, though. If it's a historical thing, if you're running some fairly realistic medieval setting, then yeah, I'm going to sit down on Wikipedia and read what life was like in the 1400s or whatever the hell,
Yeah.
Especially if I'm fleshing out a new city or have an NPC. Yeah.
A website that I often go to, just for inspiration, is, one, Wikipedia, 2, TV tropes. I spend hours there at a time just going down rabbit holes and seeing where it comes out. Because, it's not actively prepping for any one particular thing, but it's just putting ideas in your head. And the more ideas in your head, the more likely you're going to be able to produce something when the time comes during a session.
That site kind of depresses me. I like that it exists, and I understand it, but it just makes me feel like every single fucking thing is just reiteration. It's just, what is the point? That you're not going to come up with something new. there just isn't something new. You don't have it. I think one thing I do like it for, though, you're right, is there's a lot of types of stories that you could hook in there, and if you're just drawing a blank, what's the next interesting thing going to be? Let's do a heist. Mm-hmm. Do a heist episode, and here's all the stuff that would go along with a heist, yeah. So what do you do when you're in that kind of weird middle valley of a campaign, though, where, like, you've run it for several sessions, you've got, like, a little bit of story going, whatever, but you're in that kind of marathon phase before you're ready to hit the big, like, climactic ending sequence stuff, but that, like, mid-season filler episodes, that may or may not propel the overarching story mm-hmm. along. What do you do to, like, dream up that stuff?
I focus on NPCs at that point in the campaign. I focus on having interesting characters who the player characters can interact with. By that point, my plot is taking form. Hopefully by that point, I'm not driving the plot anymore. Mm-hmm. The players and their decisions are driving the plot, and they are coming up with plans to counter whatever the main conflict of the campaign is. Mm-hmm. So I'm not making. I might be making some new monsters, statting out things that are very likely to come up, but mostly I'm focusing on just fleshing out the world, coming up with the reason, making sure that the reasons why everything is happening makes sense. Mm-hmm. And that's the point where I start realizing, oh shit, there's a plot hole here. I need to fill that hole.
Do you think some settings are easier to prep for than others?
Prepping for Star Trek would be very easy for me because I know that setting inside and out, because I love it, and I have immersed myself in the setting and what exists there to the point where I feel like I could run most of a campaign off the cuff. Mm-hmm. Basically anything that I have devoted years of my life to reading about, I feel like would be an easy thing to do. And for that reason, modern day is probably the easiest thing to run. Mm-hmm. Because I, as the game master, know it, and hopefully all of the players around the table know it.
Yeah.
So there's a lot less you have to invent whole cloth and hope that the player characters understand what it is and what you are presenting to them.
As a side benefit, I agree completely. As a side benefit, I think that you get a lot more done per session because you don't have to spend all that time explaining weird sci-fi stuff or weird magical stuff or whatever the fuck. It's like, no, it's just an office building.
Yeah. You can say, okay, you guys go to Columbus. You don't have to explain what it is.
Yeah. As you approach the vast metropolis of Columbus, you become extremely disappointed.
So, immediately before the game, mm-hmm. in the minutes or the few hours before the game, mm-hmm. I try to go over my notes. I try to refresh myself of what I've prepared, and not only prepare for the session, but kind of go over my overall notes, like the Cliff's Notes version of my notes for the campaign, so that I have a good idea of what all is happening, what I'm planning on happening for the upcoming session, and kind of the trajectory where I see things going. I try to do this twice, where we play during the week. I do this at lunch, and then if I have enough time, I will try to do it before I even come to to meet at Kyle's. Mm-hmm. That's usually why I've already eaten, is because I go eat by myself, so I can go over everything in my mind before mm-hmm. we actually get there. Mm-hmm. Do you do anything similar to that?
Yeah, I'll do that. Like, usually if I'm running a campaign, depending on what day it is, if I don't have to do anything the next morning after the game, I'll go home and do a bunch of work on it right when everything is still fresh in my mind. I may not like complete the whole session or whatever, but a lot of stuff that's just immediately kicking around, I'll get that down then. Then usually throughout the week, as ideas pop up or whatever, I might go back and jot down a couple more little things. But I'll have one day in there somewhere where I devote to, assembling as much of what I want to have ready as possible. Usually I'll do it like sitting around the living room while watching a movie or an episode of something similar. I'm a fucking hopeless thief, and if I see a episode storyline that I like, I'm gonna reskin the shit out of it and use as much of that as I like. But then, like the day of, I'll spend a little bit of time going over rules if they're gonna be relevant, but definitely looking over my notes, and like a lot of times I'll like speculate about what's going on in characters' minds, like the player characters. I mean, I like to create like these weird like Skinner boxy kind of scenarios with games, presenting dilemmas and stuff to the player characters and trying to stir shit among them. And so like when we were running that factions game, and I'm like texting questions to people, getting people to send me ideas, all the conniving shit that's going on behind the scenes, like I'm having to keep track of like where your plots are going, where Nina's plots are going, whatever, and figure out where those might bump up against each other. If you've got some NPC going off to the warehouse to steal this thing, and someone else has got an NPC going over there at this time, neither one of you are gonna know what's going on, and so I have to decide, does your NPC report back, hey, I saw this NPC over here, whatever, that kind of shit. So there's like this complicated meta that you have to keep track of, and bear in mind that this is a 4-dimensional world that you're maintaining, and it's so that kind of stuff that takes a lot of thought. That's going to be different in different kinds of games, of course, but you have to maintain a consistency to the world when your players are doing stuff. And so I try to have a constant update going session on session. Okay, I know that all these things have happened, and this person emailed me this week that they want to do this at this time. So the current state of things is this, and then we start the game from there. I've tried running sessions without doing that, like, refresh of the world, before you sit down. It's a fucking clusterfuck. You're gonna forget stuff. You're gonna have somebody like, oh, well, what about this that I asked you about last week? Yeah. My bad. What about this guy? I put him to work on that 3 weeks ago and he never got back to me. Like, that's terrible. So yeah, I think maintaining that illusion of consistency is the main thing that I try to have ready in my head when I start up. Yeah.
I think we've done enough for tonight, unless you've got any other points you want to go over.
I think it's worth making a point about improvising, that no matter how much prep that you want to put into it, you're going to have to deal with stuff, of course, that you weren't ready for. And often it's going to be extremely different than anything that you're ready for. And I'm always nervous when I'm running a game, especially when I have to come up with shit off the top of my head. And you just gotta take a minute to fucking breathe sometimes. Like, don't let these 6 assholes who are your friends needling you with questions and, like, putting you on tilt. And don't let yourself get in this, like, on your back foot kind of stance. Like, if you gotta take a minute to just sort some shit out, just say so, and just sit there and work out the implications or come up with some answer to their question. There's nothing wrong with a 5-minute break. It's easy to freak out, and it's easy to get defensive about your work and get imposter syndrome or whatever, but everybody's there to have fun, so just take a breath and get your balance and keep going.
Yeah, I've never not been nervous before a session.
No matter how much prep you do.
Yeah.
Hell, sometimes there's a perverse relationship there where the more you've prepped, the more nervous you are that you got this monstrosity that you've put together that you're going to try to present to people. Like,
all right. So for geek things, I really don't have a whole lot. I do have this one thing that I got for Christmas that's a really cool geek thing. It's called Role-Playing Game Boards by Hexers. It's a box that looks like it would have board games, and what is inside of it are several. I don't remember the dimensions, but it's like 2 feet by 2 feet fold out boards that are dry erase, and a couple of them are pretty much blank, but the rest of them have like patterns on them that could be like backgrounds for role playing games, like for the mats or for the game board that you're setting your miniatures on. It's all dry erase. Just a fucking awesome toy that I got for Christmas. Thank you very much, Jordan. It is awesome.
You're very welcome. Merry Christmas, Clayton. My geek thing, I found this app that somebody suggested to me, and I'm sure people have probably used these for a long time, but it's new to me. It's a to-do / self-improvement app that's completely skinned in the context of a role-playing game. It's called Do It Now is the one that I found. It's on Android. I don't know about Apple people. But yeah, you can define your own skills that you want to work on, put XP rewards for how much time you spend on them, getting gold, whatever. I just filled out some of the stuff online last night. I'm like level 2 now, I think, something like that. Working on level 2. But it's pretty cool. It's much more fun than the boring ass to-do apps that I've been playing. And it gives you this weird graph of like all of your skills, and actually kind of, it's fairly introspective when you like fill it out a little bit. It's like, holy shit, I do spend a lot of time on programming and very little time on like dealing with normal people. Mm-hmm. It's I have a very lopsided skill set if I ever statted myself out. Anyway, that's my geek thing.
All right, Jordan, what do you say we stop this bullshit and start rolling some dice?
All right.
This has been a production of Alien Familiar Media. You can find past episodes and more at alienfamiliar.com. You can email us at alienfamiliarmedia@gmail.com. This production is protected under a Creative Commons non-commercial attribution, no derivatives license. Music for this episode is Suburban Outlaw by Forget the Whale and can be found at freemusicarchive.org.